I did not have a house in October of 1886. I want to say that plainly before I say anything else, because there are people still living in Granger Hollow who would dress the story up if they told it themselves, and the dressing up is how the truth gets buried. I had a rented corner room above the dry goods store, a sister named Mabel who slept on the far side of the same narrow mattress, a dog called Soot who had followed Cord home from the timber camp the spring before Cord died, and a bundle of my father's things wrapped in oilcloth that I had carried from the farmhouse when the bankman came for the keys. That was the whole of what I owned, and I had spent most of the walk into town convincing myself it was enough. The way you talk yourself past a shut gate on a cold morning, putting one foot in front of the other because stopping does not open it. The farm note had come due the first week of October. Cord Kalk, my husband of 7 years, had died of a chest sickness in September, which left me the note, the land, the account at Hearn's store that was $30 short of settled, and the understanding, unspoken but perfectly clear in every face at the funeral, that a widow without sons and without capital was a kind of arithmetic problem the community had not agreed to solve. Dale Hearn, who ran the store and spoke for the council more often than the council had elected him to, had told me I might settle the account in labor over the winter if I was willing to be useful. He said it with his hands folded on the counter, his voice mild as creek water in July, and I thanked him in the same tone and left. I did not intend to be useful to Dale Hearn. What I intended was harder to explain, and I did not try to explain it to anyone in those first weeks. Mabel understood because she had grown up hearing the same things I had heard, and Soot understood because he was a dog, and dogs know the difference between a person doing a necessary thing and a person lost. But to the rest of Granger Hollow, I was simply a widow who had taken a room above the dry goods and was seen increasingly at odd hours on the bank above Granger Creek with a short-handled mattock and a lantern, chipping at the frozen clay face of the bluff. I did not yet know what Dale Hearn would eventually call it. I did not yet understand what the winter was going to ask of me, or what it was going to ask of the men who watched from the porch and laughed. If you have ever watched something be called foolish right up until the moment it proved essential, then you already know the shape of what happened in Granger Hollow in the winter of 1887. Stay with me, and I will tell you how the shape was made. My father's name was Silas Kalk. He was a water finder, which in Fayette County in those years meant something more than a man with a willow fork, though he used those too. And he could read a hillside the way another man reads a page, finding the text in the seam of the rock, the color of the clay, the way a stand of cress grew thick in one particular bend of a field. He had come to the hollow from across the Cumberland when he was young, following water the way some men follow gold. And he had stayed because the limestone country there held water in a way that rewarded patience and observation rather than brute digging. He farmed a small piece and found water for neighbors who needed a well dug, and the fees were modest but consistent, and over the years he accumulated something more useful than capital. He accumulated a detailed and intimate understanding of the ground beneath the hollow, a knowledge that lived in his hands and in the specific, unhurried movements of his eye across a rock face, and that he could not have put on paper for another man any more than a violinist could write down what her hands knew about pressure. He taught me to look for seep lines before I was 12. A seep line is the dark vein you see in winter rock where water bleeds through the limestone face and does not quite freeze, even in the hardest cold, because the water is moving and moving water keeps its own temperature the way a living thing does, a few degrees ahead of the frost that locks everything else. You look for the dark place in the gray face. You put your palm near it and feel whether the air is a degree or two warmer there than 4 feet to either side. Father could find them with his eyes half shut, walking a bluff face the way another man walks a familiar road, his hands trailing occasionally over the rock, pausing at a likely place, checking the change in air temperature with the back of his fingers, because the back of the hand is more sensitive than the palm for that particular reading. He called it listening to what the stone has kept, which is the kind of phrase that sounds like poetry, until you have done it enough times that it becomes straightforwardly descriptive. The lessons were practical and patient. He would walk me along a stretch of limestone bluff and ask me to find the seep before he showed me. And when I missed one, he would not simply point to it, but would ask me instead to look again from a different angle, at a different time of day, because the dark of a seep line reads differently in afternoon light than in morning. And understanding that difference was part of the knowledge. He told me the names for the different kinds of water movement in limestone, the slow percolation through solid rock, and the faster sheeting along fracture lines, and the deep artesian pressure that could find a small crack and widen it over a century until it ran in a steady thread. And while I did not retain all of the names, I retained the principle behind them, which was that rock is not solid to water, only resistant, and resistance and impermeability are not the same thing. He had taken me to the bluff above Granger Creek when I was perhaps 14 and shown me the seep line I later came back to as a widow, a dark finger-wide stain running down the limestone face for about 3 feet, and below it, where the bank had been undercut by a high spring years before, a hollow that went back 8 feet into the earth, cool and damp and smelling of mineral water and old clay. He held the lantern inside it and turned to me with the same expression he used when I finally parsed something he had been trying to teach. "The earth does not freeze all the way down," he said. "Find the line where the cold stops and the cold cannot follow you." I was 14, and it seemed like a lesson about geological curiosity. I did not understand until I was 34 and cold and hungry that it had been a lesson about survival. He left me a leather field journal when he died, 4 years before Cord, the pages dense with his cramped notation of seep lines and spring mouths and underground water tables across 3 counties, each entry giving the location and the season of the reading, and a small penciled sketch of the rock formation and the direction of water movement. He had been keeping the journal for more than 20 years when he died, and the accumulated entries formed a kind of autobiography of the ground beneath Fayette County, a record of all the places water ran in the dark where no one above could see it running. He left Mabel and me no land and no money, because he had never accumulated either. But I have thought many times since that the journal was the better inheritance. You can lose land in a bad season. You can lose money in a foreclosure. What lives in the hands and in the eye is harder to take away, provided you have used it often enough that it has become your own and not merely your father's. I went to the bluff above Granger Creek for the first time in late October, 2 weeks after the bankman took the keys. The leaves were mostly down by then, and the creek was running dark under a skim of early ice along its edges, and I found the seep line exactly where I had left it in memory, dark and slightly damp in the gray limestone, the air near it carrying that familiar trace of warmth that was not warmth exactly, but the absence of the deepest cold. I put my hand in the hollow beneath it. The stone inside was cool, not frozen. I stood there for a while with soot at my knee and the wind off the ridge pressing at my back, and I thought about what my father had told me, about the line where the cold stopped, and I made the decision I had probably been building toward since the farm note came due. I began cutting the steps the following morning. 12 steps, I decided, because the hollow sat 12 feet below the bank's lip, and I wanted a true cut stairway, not a scramble, something I could carry a loaded basket up in the dark without spilling. I used Cord's short mattock and an iron-tipped bar he had kept for fence work. and on the first morning I cut 2 steps before my arms gave out, and I went back to the room above the dry goods with my hands so cold I had to hold them over the lamp for 10 minutes before I could feel them properly. But the steps were there, 2 rough-cut shelves in the frozen clay, already beginning to harden further in the air, and I had taken the measure of how many mornings the rest would cost me. Dale Hearn noticed within the week. He could see the bluff from the porch of his store if he turned his head, and Dale Hearn was the kind of man who turned his head. One morning when I came up from the bank with the mattock over my shoulder and clay on my skirt hem, I heard his voice carry across the road, easy and amused, speaking to the 2 or 3 men who kept him company most mornings. "She is cutting steps into the creek bank," he said. "That is Vera Kalk's great work for the winter season, going down to tend her ice steps." The men laughed, not loud, not cruel exactly, just comfortable, the laugh of people who have not yet been asked to reconsider anything. I kept walking. I did not look at the porch. I cut the remaining 10 steps over the next 3 weeks, working in the early mornings before the day's cold deepened and Mabel was awake. And when the stairway was finished, I began the real work, which was shaping the hollow into something that could hold stores. This part was slower and more exacting than the cutting, because the hollow had not been used for anything, and its ceiling was irregular, and the floor was bare clay that had never been fitted with stone. And every improvement had to be made in the cold and in lantern light, with hands that stiffened if I paused too long between movements. I drove ash poles into the ceiling clay to keep it from slumping over a damp winter. 8 poles in 2 rows, each one set at 8-foot centers because Father's journal had noted, in one of his careful entries from 1871, that unsupported clay overhead over a span of more than 9 feet was prone to shearing along old freeze lines during a hard, cold snap, where the surface freeze worked down into the bank far enough to reach the upper layers of the hollow ceiling and crack them along their natural planes. The poles were not elegant. They were cut from second-growth ash on the hillside behind the old farm, which I had asked and been permitted to take, and they were rough to fit the ceiling clay tightly, driven up with a mallet, and then wedged with flat chips of limestone so they would not work loose in the wet season. Between them I stretched a length of canvas that Cord had used for wagon cover, cutting it to fit the span and tacking its edges to the pole faces with copper tacks I had saved from the farm's tack box, so that any drip from the ceiling would run to the canvas edges and fall at the wall, rather than directly onto the stored food. The floor I fitted with flat stones from the creek bed, carrying them up the steps 2 at a time in a cloth basket, gray limestone slabs of roughly even thickness that I set close together with a little dry clay packed in the gaps, so the root vegetables would rest on stone rather than bare earth and would not draw the earth's cold up through their skins. Along the lower walls I set upright planks from a broken-down bin I had salvaged from the old barn, which formed low ledge walls that kept the wooden boxes of stored food separated from the clay walls, because a clay wall breathes moisture in thaw weather and moist contact over a winter rots any wood it touches. On the back wall, where the spring water seeped through the limestone in a thin, consistent thread and ran in a narrow channel to the creek, I set a clay-lined catch basin, 6 inches deep, pressing the clay smooth and firing it twice with coals from the room stove carried down in an iron pot, so that it hardened to something near ceramic and would hold water without absorbing it back into the bank. The spring water collected in the basin cold and clear at all times, clean to drink and cold enough to keep a butter crock fresh, and the overflow ran in its old channel down toward the creek without pooling. The temperature in the hollow I measured with my hand and with the small tin thermometer I had carried from the farmhouse, held steady between 40 and 44 degrees through November and into early December, even when the air outside dropped below 20 at night. Father had been right to a single degree. In late November, I brought in the first stores. I had spent what was left of a small account Cord had kept, not with Hearn, but with a man in the next town, on 60 pounds of smoked pork shoulder and flank, which I wrapped in muslin and hung from the ash poles on iron hooks that I had bent from wrought iron at the old farm forge during the last week I had access to it. 80 pounds of sweet potatoes and turnips went onto the stone-fitted shelves in wooden boxes with straw between them, and 3 crocks of rendered lard, sealed with cloth and tallow, went into the corner nearest the spring. I laid in dried beans in flour sack cloth, a half bushel of dried corn, salt in a stone crock. Mabel stood at the top of the steps more than once during these hauling days and said nothing for a long while, watching me come up empty-handed and go back down loaded. Then one evening she climbed down herself and held the lantern while I arranged the potato boxes, and she looked at the poles and the canvas ceiling and the spring-fed catch basin, and she said, "How did you know it would hold this temperature?" I told her what Father had said, that the cold is a surface thing, that below the frost line the earth holds its own steady warmth, that the spring had not frozen in living memory because moving water carries its temperature independent of the air above it. She turned the lantern slowly and looked at everything I had done, the poles, the stone floor, the canvas, the clay basin catching that thin silver thread of spring water. Then she said, "All right, I want to tell you something about that phrase." Mabel was 26 that winter and had spent most of her life being the quieter of Silas Calk's daughters, the one who deferred, who watched, who reached her conclusions slowly and then held them without any great noise. When she said all right, she meant it the way a careful person means it, which is to say she had measured the thing and found it sound. It was the only approval that mattered to me that season, and I carried it down into December the way you carry a coal in your pocket on a cold walk. I will say here, before we reach the worst of what is coming, that I have thought about those weeks in the hollow and what they taught me about the difference between knowledge and the performance of knowledge. And if you have found this story worth your time so far, I think you will want to stay for what January brought to Granger Hollow. But that is ahead of us still. On the first day of January, a Thursday, I went to Hearn's store for salt and found 3 men from the upper end of the hollow standing at the counter discussing the winter ahead. One of them, a man named Tuis who kept cattle on the ridge, said the cold would be nothing worse than usual, and Hearn agreed, and the third man, whose name I never caught, nodded. When I set my salt on the counter, Hearn glanced at me and said, "Still working on the ice steps, Mrs. Calk." The others smiled not unkindly the way men smile when they are rehearsing a familiar agreement. I paid for the salt and said the steps were finished and the hollow was stocked and I thought they would serve. Hearn said he expected they might, for a root cellar, and then turned back to his conversation. Outside, the cold stood at 6 degrees and a wind had started off the ridge, the early edge of something larger, though none of us on that Thursday knew yet what it was going to cost. There was a community gathering in December before Christmas at the church hall on the Ridge Road, the kind of evening that Granger Hollow put together when the season called for it. Tables of food, the men standing in clusters near the stove, the women arranging things. I had gone because Mabel wanted to go and because I had no particular reason to stay away. Dale Hearn was there with his wife and the men from the store porch, and at some point in the evening, while I was standing near the window with a cup of cider, I heard him tell the story of the steps to a small audience of his neighbors, embroidering it with the details he found most useful. A widow woman with a mattock, building herself a hole in the riverbank, calling it a larder, as if the cold creek mud was going to keep her sweet potatoes through a Fayette County January. He had given it a name by then. He called it Vera's Ice Steps, and the name had the quality of a settled thing, the way a name does when it has been used often enough to feel inevitable. Vera's ice steps, he said, and a woman I did not know well laughed politely, and a man I knew slightly looked at his boots, and Ruth Elder, who lived 2 farms west of where Cord and I had kept our place, said in a plain voice that it seemed a practical enough solution for a woman with no root cellar of her own. Dale Hearn gave her the patient look men give a woman who has pointed out something inconvenient. Practical, he said, in a frozen clay bank in January. Practical is not the word I would reach for. Ruth Elder looked at him steadily. You haven't been down there, she said. The room did not quite go quiet, but the conversation shifted direction, and the moment passed the way such moments do, into the current of the evening, submerged. I watched Hearn's face during the exchange and felt nothing in particular. No satisfaction at Ruth's objection, no bitterness at his confidence. What I felt was an absence of surprise. He was not wrong to be skeptical if he had not been inside the hollow and had not read the thermometer, and had not studied the seep line the way my father had taught me. He was working from what he could see from a porch, and a porch does not show you everything. I had placed the ash poles at 8-foot centers in the ceiling, because Father's journal noted that unsupported clay over a span of more than 9 feet was prone to shearing along old freeze lines in a hard, cold snap. The poles were not visible from the bank's lip. What Hearn could see was a woman going into a hole with a basket. He could not see what the hole contained, or what it was anchored against. The first hard cold came on the 7th of January. The thermometer I kept nailed to the door frame above the dry goods read 18 below at 6 in the morning, and by noon it had risen only to 12 below, and by nightfall it had settled back to 16 below, and the sky had taken the particular flat gray color that in Fayette County means the cold is not planning to leave. Soot would not go outside that morning without encouragement, which I have always considered a reasonable assessment from an animal whose nose touches the ground. I went down the steps with the lantern and checked the hollow, and found it at 42 degrees, the spring still moving in its narrow channel, a faint condensation on the ash poles above the potato shelves. Everything precisely as I had left it. The freeze held for 21 days. I counted them later when Theo Foss asked me to reconstruct the sequence for his field notes, and the counting made the winter feel different, as if giving each day a number had the power to put it in its place. 21 days at or below 15 degrees, with 3 mornings that reached -22, and through all of them the hollow held its temperature within 2 degrees of 40. The spring ran, and the stored food did not diminish except by my own hand. The community's stores were a different arithmetic. Dale Hearn had 200 pounds of cornmeal in his back room that he had meant to hold through March, packed in flour barrels with oilcloth over the tops in the manner that had served him through 7 previous winters. But his back room shared a wall with the north side of the building, which, in a cold of this particular severity, lost its insulating character entirely, and by the 3rd week of January, the cold had gotten into the sealed barrels in ways that made the meal go sour and clumped along the frozen edges, and the barrel meat he had brined in October had partly spoiled in the thaw and refreeze of the room's uneven temperature, the fat having separated and gone rancid in the cycling. He lost, by his own accounting to Theo Foss afterward, most of what he had planned to carry families through to spring. The Pender homestead lost 4 hogs to the cold in a single night, the pen wall having given on the north side in the deepest night of the freeze, and the hogs had not survived the exposure. 3 of the 4 had been intended for spring butchering and the family's winter salt meat supply, and their loss meant the Penders were running on corn and dried beans and the single hog they had put up in October, which was not going to last to the thaw at the rate 4 people ate. Their corn bin was exhausted by the 1st week of February. The Vanover family, who kept their root vegetables in a below-floor cellar of the kind that was common in the hollow, found their cellar had taken water from a frost crack in the foundation, and a quarter of their potato stores had frozen solid and gone to mash in the subsequent thaw, useless for anything but composting when the ground softened. Old Milo Pender told me later that in his 61 years in Fayette County, he had not seen a freeze run that deep for that many consecutive days, and he had seen some winters. By February 8th, Ruth Elder told me afterward she had counted 11 households in the hollow, running short, some rationing to one cooked meal a day, some of the older families burning their seed corn for fuel to keep warm, which is the kind of decision that costs twice, once now and once in the planting season, when the ground softens and there is nothing to put in it. The families who had bought into Hearn's common grain store as a winter hedge were in particular difficulty, because the loss of his backroom stores was a shared loss. 2 families had children who were sick with a cold weather cough that needed feeding and warmth to recover from, and the feeding was becoming the harder problem of the 2. On February 8th, I went down the steps with my lantern and stood in the hollow and looked at what remained. 60 pounds of smoked meat still hanging from the poles, the muslin wrappers clean and dry in the stable air, 80 pounds of root vegetables, the potatoes beginning to soften slightly at the skins, but sound and whole. 3 crocks of lard intact, the spring running at its ordinary trickle. The thermometer read 42 degrees, and the cold outside was 16 below. And the difference between those 2 numbers was not nothing. It was the length and the shape of the lesson my father had spent a lifetime trying to teach me. I stood there for a while with the lantern and soot's warm side against my shin, and I did not feel triumphant, because there were families a quarter mile away eating 1 meal a day. And that was not a cause for triumph. What I felt was a particular kind of readiness, the feeling of a tool that has been made correctly arriving at the moment it was made for. Dale Hearn came to the bank on the morning of February 9th. I heard his boots on the frozen ground before I saw him, that particular crunch of a heavy man on packed snow, and I came up the steps with a cloth parcel of dried and smoked pork that I had wrapped the night before, because I had known someone would come eventually, and I had wanted to be ready. He was standing at the lip of the bank, hat down against the wind, his coat collar turned up, and he looked at the 12 steps cut into the clay face, smooth now and worn a little at the edges from my own use across the winter. And then he looked down into the darkness where the lantern hung on its pole. And then he looked at me and the parcel in my hands. He stood there for a long moment. No one spoke. Soot sat at the top step and watched him with the calm patience of an animal that has seen everything this winter and expects no surprises. The creek ran below us, still open in the center where the current was strong, ice shelved at its edges. The cold pressed down from the ridge, and the sky was the same flat gray it had been for 3 weeks, offering nothing. "You read the ground right," Hearn said. He said it the way a man says a thing he has prepared himself to say, quietly and without elaboration, because the elaboration would cost too much. I held out the parcel. He took it. He turned it once in his hands, feeling the weight, and I watched his face, which was not ashamed and not relieved and not grateful exactly, but was something quieter and more permanent than any of those. The face of a man setting down a comfortable assumption that had grown too heavy to carry. He did not say anything else, and I did not need him to. I brought 12 people into the hollow over the following 3 days, not all at once, but in the way that news travels in a small community, by ones and twos, Ruth Elder bringing old Milo Pender in the morning, the Vanover family in the afternoon, children bundled against the cold, coming down the steps carefully with their hands on the clay walls and their eyes wide in the lantern light, The children were the ones who felt the temperature change most immediately. 4 steps below the surface, you could see them stop and raise their chins as if scenting something. The particular alertness a person shows when warmth arrives unexpectedly, when the body registers a fact the mind has not yet formed into a sentence. The hollow smelled of cold mineral water and wood smoke from the lantern and the sweet straw scent of the potato boxes. And it was 42 degrees, and it was quiet, and the ash poles held the ceiling steady above all of them. I gave out what I had in measures I had already calculated, enough for each household to carry through to the thaw, portioned from the stores without running short myself, which is the only way to give and stay sound at the same time. Some families took smoked meat wrapped in muslin cloth. Some took sweet potatoes and a portion of dried corn. Old Milo Pender took 2 crocks of bean and a wedge of lard, and would not take more, though I pressed him, because he was the kind of man who had given to his neighbors for 40 years, and was not easy with the reversal. I understood that. There are things that cost the recipient more than they cost the giver, and dignity is one of them, and I cut his portion the way I saw he needed it cut, without ceremony and without comment, which is all you can do. The hollow held them all without crowding. The ash pole ceiling did not shear. The spring ran clear into March. Theo Foss came in the 2nd week of March, when the thaw had begun softening the top steps, and the creek was running loud with melt. He was the county recorder, a spare, careful man with a notebook he held at a precise angle when he wrote in it. And he came because Ruth Elder had written to the county office about the Cold Spring larder on the Granger Creek bank, and he had been sent to make a field note of it. He went down the steps twice, once to look and once to measure, and he asked me a number of questions about the construction, the temperature readings, the source of the method. I answered them plainly. When he asked about my father, I told him about Silas and the seep lines and the journal, and he wrote it down in his careful hand, and that notation in his field book was the first time the method was set down outside of memory. By the spring of 1888, 7 families along Granger Creek had cut their own bank caches. Some cut 3 steps, some cut 6. One family cut 10. And emerged at a hollow that ran dry by February, because they had chosen a bank face without a seep line, without reading the limestone for the dark, wet vein that marks moving water below. The lesson of that particular failure was not that the method was wrong, but that the method was not the steps. The steps were the visible thing, the thing you could copy without understanding. The invisible thing, the thing my father had spent 30 years learning to see in the gray face of a winter bluff, was the water beneath. Copying the shape of what I had done saved people's cornmeal. Understanding why I had done it in that particular place on that particular bank was harder to transmit, and I found in the years that followed that only 2 or 3 of the families who came to me to learn it ever truly learned to read the seep line. The rest built caches in approximately the right kind of place and got approximately the right result, which is not the same thing, but it was enough. It was more than the barrel in the back room had given them. By 1891, families in 2 neighboring counties had cut bank caches after visiting Granger Hollow in the spring, and Theo Foss had included the Cold Spring larder method in a county agricultural pamphlet he wrote that year, citing Silas Kalk's field journal as the source. He spelled my father's name correctly, which I noticed and which pleased me more than I expected it to. There are worse monuments than a name in a county pamphlet, and there are worse things to be remembered as than the man who taught his daughter to read cold ground. Dale Hearn asked me in the spring of 1887 if I would teach him the seep line reading. I said I would. He was not a graceful student, because he had spent too many years being the kind of man who already knows the answer, but he was a willing one, which counts for more. He did not call it Vera's ice steps after that winter, By 1889, he called it a Cold Spring cache when he mentioned it, which is the name Theo Foss had used in his pamphlet. And the old name fell away the way contemptuous names tend to when the thing they described has proven its worth too plainly to sustain the contempt. Mabel married a man from the next hollow in 1889 and moved 8 miles east, and before she left she came with me, one last time to the bank above the creek, and we went down the steps together and stood in the hollow with the lantern, the way we had stood there the first winter, and she said, "Father would have liked to know it held." I said I thought he probably did know, in whatever way the dead come to know the things that matter to them. That is not a thing I would have said to Dale Hearn, but Mabel was Silas Calk's daughter, too, and she understood the grammar of it. The steps are still there. Not the original steps, which had to be recut twice as the bank face shifted with the seasons, but steps in the same place, cut by the same method, descending to the same hollow above the same seep line, in the same limestone face. A family called Bright has worked that portion of the creek for 30 years now, and they maintain the cache as a matter of course, the same way you maintain a well or a fence line, because it is part of the property's working intelligence, and they understand that. Their youngest daughter came to me some years ago, curious about the history, and I told her what I am telling you now, including the part about Dale Hearn, and the porch, and the name he gave the steps before he understood what the steps were for. She asked me if I had been angry, and I said no, not exactly. I had been cold. There is a difference between cold and angry, even when the cold is partly made by other people's comfort. And the difference is that cold has a practical answer if you look for it in the right place. My father showed me where to look. The rest was just mornings with a mattock and the willingness to go down in the dark to see what the ground was holding. Soot was an old dog the last winter I spent in that hollow, gray-muzzled, slow on the steps but steady. He would lie on the top step in the late afternoon when the sun came low and hit the limestone face at the angle that warmed it a few degrees, and he would sleep there with his chin on his paws and his dark coat catching every bit of what the season offered. I would come up from the hollow with the lantern and find him there, and set the lantern down and sit beside him for a few minutes before we went in, the two of us looking at the creek running below and the sky going pale above the ridge. The seep line ran dark and quiet in the stone face, just as my father had found it, just as it had run the morning I put my palm near it and felt what lived below the cold, that thin dark vein moving when everything else was frozen. What is underneath is what holds,